Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of SBI Alumni Speak, a discussion on racial equity, the economic crisis, and how we draw our path forward. My name is Kelly Downing. I'll be your host and moderator for this evening, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm a senior faculty member currently at the Writing Revolution, which is a nonprofit organization that works to train teachers in the Hochman method, which is a writing method that trains teachers to deliver explicit instruction in writing. I'm also a former English teacher at A. Philip Randolph Campus High School, which is very, very dear to my heart. It is where I got my first start as a teacher and where I was first introduced to this amazing organization, SBI, and Mr. Charles Thompson, its founder and executive director. So I just want to thank everybody again for tuning in, and just really, your participation this evening is very, very critical, particularly given the topic and given the times. But for the past 30 years, SBI's mission has been to educate, organize, and mobilize. And this platform this evening and this discussion is right in line with that. In order to really deal with problems that are particular to our community, it's important that we educate ourselves, and that's what this forum is doing, providing that knowledge so we can make informed decisions. And then we're organizing by coming together. This is a show of that solidarity and that commitment to really be in one accord. And then the next piece of it is just not to just stay there, but to mobilize and to do something about that. So I'm very excited. We have a very distinguished panel of guests and speakers that are very, very close to SBI, and I don't want to take up much time, so I'm going to allow each of them to introduce themselves, and then we'll get underway.
Hello, my name is Dr. Stephanie Akungbube. I am a proud SBI alum, and I currently serve as the interim assistant dean of academic affairs at Kingsborough Community College.
Good evening, I'm Dr. Alicia Taylor. I'm a 1992 graduate of A. Philip Randolph, and I'm proud to have been in the first cohort of SBI. And I'm currently the principal advisor at Herald Advisors, which is my consulting firm, and I work in international development and education.
Welcome.
Hey, good evening. My name is Mwanza Lumumba. I'm a graduate of A. Philip Randolph, as well as a participant in SBI when I was at A. Philip Randolph. Now I work in marketing. I'm a director of marketing at Pernod Ricard, working on whiskeys, gins, and really looking forward to this session, and thanks for having me.
Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. My name is LaShawn Francis, and I graduated from A. Philip Randolph in 2003. I work for a state-based advocacy organization in California called Children Now.
Thank you. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Flores. I graduated from A. Philip Randolph in 2015. I graduated from Gettysburg College this past December and started working for an organization that provides citizen reentry centers, affordable housing, and homeless shelters to different communities in DC, New York, and in Miami. So I work in the residential and commercial development side of that as a research and development analyst.
Welcome. Thank you, Jennifer.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Anthony Rodriguez, A. Philip Randolph, class of 2010. I was on the tech team with SBI, helping with a lot of the performing arts programming as a stage manager. I'm now working as a management analyst for the City and County of Denver. It is a pleasure to be on this panel. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you again. And clearly, just from everybody's introduction, we can see just how diverse our background and our perspectives are, and it is going to make for a very enriching discussion. When we look at what's happening now, particularly as of recent, we have to put everything under the backdrop or in the context, obviously, of the pandemic and COVID-19. And when we talk about racial equity in terms of that, we know that there's been huge disparities in terms of its impact on communities of color. And I know that each of you have, in some way, shape, or form, obviously have been impacted. But when we look at that word equity, it means to be fair or impartial. And so when we look at this concept of racial equity, and then we look at the backdrop of our policing, let's say, Breonna Taylor, Stephon Clark, Eric Garner, Tatiana Jefferson, and the list can go on and on and on. how can we look at that and see equity? When we look at, again, the economic impact that this is having, right? How can we then see equity when we know that what's happening in the images and those messages around us are not saying it? So my question is, how can we empower ourselves to establish equity when we have these vast images that are telling us otherwise? And anyone can really jump in. And you can look at it from those that are on the field, I guess, in terms of, you know, social services, and maybe through the lens of the constituents that you serve or what you've seen. But if you could speak to that, that would be awesome.
So the way I see this first happening and being effective is through collective action. So actually coming together as a community and really working together to figure out what each unique community needs in order to, one, with the pandemic, to combat the effects of the pandemic in the community, but also bigger picture to deal with a lot of like the everydays of systematic racism that have existed before COVID too, like the things that still plague our communities, like policing in our communities, for example. Instead of relying on the NYPD, we should be coming together as a community and providing community policing so that we can protect each other. That's sort of the first thing that comes to mind when I think of establishing equity among ourselves.
Right.
Yeah, I totally. You first, Alicia.
Oh, thank you. Two things come to mind for me really quickly. I think the first is that we can empower ourselves just by understanding how power operates and sort of interrogating power and understanding just how policies are made, following the money, how our decisions made. And I think separately from that and what we do in our work, I think in terms of empowerment, it's critical to focus on self-care. And I'm sort of preaching to myself now, because even just with the opening that you gave and the framing for this question, Kelly, and as you were going through the list of individuals who have been murdered, and then just looking at the amount of information and trauma that we're taking in constantly every day, just to remember that we have to take a step back and make sure that we're checking in with ourselves and taking care of ourselves so that we don't burn out, because this is clearly about to be, or we're in a long run.
And I think that was a good point, like the notions that, and I've spoken about this before, like our institutions and those organizations that were for us, by us, they were already fragile before, you know, COVID-19. And I think during this pandemic, we've seen how fragile our institutions are and how we do need to come together, to your point, to really kind of just empower ourselves. We cannot rely on outside sources to take care of the issues that are really specific to us and our community. I'm wondering if there is anything in terms of maybe your professional lens that you've seen in terms of equity, or that shift in equity, maybe again with the constituents that you serve, or is there anything that might not be on the radar? Because a lot of times we're affected and we don't know, you know, until we vocalize like what it is that we're feeling or how we're impacted, we don't know. So I'm not sure if you see something that most people are not even paying attention, you know. Can you share or shed any insight in terms of that, what you've seen in your professional practices maybe?
So not necessarily connected to my profession, but just in general, I think, you know, a lot of times people will start to feel helpless when they see all the things that are happening in the world and what you can do. And I think sometimes we forget the power that we have. And I think whether it's through organizations or through your personal efforts, you know, everybody can make a difference. And I know it sounds really cliche, but, you know, some folks, obviously it's just about getting out into the streets, right, and protesting. But there's other things that the movement needs, right? The movement needs money. The movement needs time. The movement needs resources and skills. And so maybe not everyone can march or get out on the street and protest, but those other things everyone has, right? Whether it's financially, your skills, the talents that you have, the network that you have. And everyone now, thanks to social media, has a voice for good or bad. And so all of those things are ways that we can empower each other and ourselves and our community. So I just would encourage people not to feel helpless, and however they feel like they can give back, find the right organizations or the right people to support that will move the needle in the direction that they're hoping to see.
To actually add on to that Dr. Taylor talked about earlier was this concept of following the money, knowing how policies impact you. And that's how I spend my day, right? That's my day job. Mm-hmm. And I live in a district that has been working for years to remove police officers from schools, from campuses. Okay. But what we're noticing is that now is the opportune time for it. But this is also political performance for a lot of our politicians. So we need community organizers, we need parents who are doing the radical inquiry and doing the work to say, okay, you have disinvested from our schools and from our communities for so long. You're removing something, but what are you replacing it with? Are we going to have social workers? Are we going to have nurses? What is the infrastructure that is going to have? So I do think it's a great time for this conversation. Mm-hmm. My only concern is that sometimes our elected officials will capitalize on that time and not deliver fully, right? They'll do 50% of the work, but there needs to be those of us who are behind them, pushing them all the way to the finish line.
Very powerful. I agree. I think that really speaks to that whole self-care and to what Mwanza was saying also about knowing that everyone has their position to play and not feeling that sense of hopelessness. Like there's something that you can do no matter how big or how small, you know what I mean, in that respect. So I think that was really powerful. Did anybody else want to add to that in terms of maybe what they've seen in terms of, their lens and their purview?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I'd like to kind of echo some of the points that were previously made. And, firstly, a lot of the issues that we're facing around racial inequities, they have existed before COVID. The pandemic just simply made these issues more visible. And to many of us, none of this that we're talking about is new. But I think there is an element of being able to capitalize, like LaShawn said, on the momentum behind the attention on the movement. And as far as the performative politicians, it is all intentional for them to get you to believe that you're helpless in this situation. Right. They are banking on people not going out and voting. And I know that every time we pull up social media, we see our current president, and he's a performer. That's who he always has been. But there is so much more on the ballot than just the presidency that impacts our communities more directly. So I would encourage people with the extra time we have at home now, try to understand what's going on locally. If you are of age, please get out there and vote. Encourage your families to do so as well. And then I think also, self-care is very important with all these traumatizing messages that we're being exposed to on a daily basis. Sometimes it's okay to, not every day is the right day to fight for you, and that's okay. If being out on the street is what works for you, that's cool. If hanging out with your family and spending time with them is what you need to do in light of this situation, then please do that too. And I think that, there is some opportunity there in the fact that a lot of people are at home and are on screens more often. I think there's an opportunity there to connect with people, to build our networks. If there was an interest that you once had, we can get in touch with anyone in the globe with technology. And I know there's some bad sides to social media, but there are also some opportunities there as well. So I'd encourage people to expand their network, as much as possible throughout these challenging times. For support, for career advice, or just for simple human connection, a well-written letter to an old friend or maybe someone in an industry you're looking to break into really goes a long way. So I'd encourage people to do that.
Right. Something that came up that I thought was interesting in terms of, again, this collaborative idea of people working together in terms of protesting and racial equity, and how that now we're seeing a galvanizing force that maybe has not existed the same way that it has in the past. And the question I have is, how do we, still under this backdrop of racial equity, how do we keep that momentum going? Is this going to be something that is, short-lived, or is this going to be something that you think is going to be able to be carried longer, or how do you feel that, about the protest movement and just being able to kind of keep this energy and this momentum going?
For me, the biggest, so I think education is how we keep this movement going. There are so many things that people are just starting to learn about due to everything that's been that the Black Lives Matter movement shed light on. For me personally, I never really understood my history as a woman of color until I got to college. And that really put me at a disadvantage because I feel like knowledge is power. And when you've been fed this narrative that your people haven't really contributed anything to society, they aren't anything, you start to internalize that and you feel insecure. So empowerment through education and learning about the different ways that systematic racism affects your day-to-day. For example, because of the field that I'm in, I automatically think about housing. So learning about how housing and lack of housing, especially for people of color, impacts communities and what you can do in that sector to make a difference, for example, is a great way to keep the movement going. So going above and beyond a lot of the common things you hear being talked about in the media, and seeing how you can, for example, find something that you necessarily connect with. So my example is housing, and seeing how you can make a difference through education and empowerment, and that I think is a really great way to keep the momentum going and really make a lasting impact.
As someone who works in housing as well, I would agree with that. I think in every major city across the country right now, gentrification and displacement is on the top of everyone's minds. And I think this movement and what's going on now, I think is going to have some lasting effects. And just to give a specific example of my work at the City and County of Denver, the whole conversation on race and equity has started to make its way into every sort of facet of operations. LaShawn and Alicia talked about the concept of following the money. So, at the City of Denver, our budget process, it's become a mandate from the mayor to look at everything that every organization in the city is doing with an equity lens. And also just looking at how that ties into the budget. One thing I noticed just working for a bunch of different organizations is it's very easy to say you stand for something, but what are you actually funding? What are you putting your resources behind? And I think that level of transparency is something that I've never seen in government before. It makes me optimistic about some of the progress that we are making. If I'm honest, I don't think it's enough, but it is a step in the right direction.
Okay, great. I'm thinking in terms of, you mentioned, Jennifer, your lane in your lens rather in looking at this through housing. I'm just thinking of it in terms of the message that we tell our youth and we tell our students that are coming up now, because the world is very, very different. Their point of entry, we have some frame of reference to when things were somewhat, there was some resemblance of normalcy, but right now the world is a very, very different place. And I'm wondering, in terms of just how we message and communicate, how does that change now? In terms of, what we should have on the forefront of our minds, as adults, but also maybe even in terms of the adolescents, and how do we raise kids to know their worth, to know that they're able to fight for that equity that we're talking about?
So I have two little girls, so I'll hop in here. I think the idea of self-worth, as you were saying, is super important, and it's something that has to be fostered and nurtured at home. And then you hope that you're able to put your children in spaces that reinforce that, specifically in educational spaces. I think thinking about classroom environments and what's being taught, what light is being cast on a lot of sort of the background that we're what's this backdrop? How is it being discussed in the classroom? What historical contexts are being given to help students and help young children understand why we are in the place that we are? I think it goes a long way. That and having very frank and open, honest conversations with children, you can't hide this from them. it doesn't even, I don't think sheltering is the way to go, I guess is what I'd say. Allowing spaces for discussion with youth is super important. We think about even just the social distancing measures, right? So taking a step away from Black Lives Matter is super important, but it's layered on with the issues of the pandemic. You think about children in preschool, the way that we are taught to interact with each other as humans. We can't do that in these spaces. And what does that do for children who are so small? Something as simple as, we were growing up, you held hands with your partner online. You can't do that. So as we talk about these bigger issues about human connection, about seeing yourself in others, about learning to care and respect and understand other perspectives, on the most basic level, those things are kind of stripped away at the moment. And so you have to be overly intentional in your discussions with youth about the importance of these larger human themes, because the nuances around race are so specific, and they have to be explored. But just when you think about the way that we have to kind of separate ourselves as a safety measure, and what that means on a deeper level for children who are starting to grow up, it's concerning, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. Like those points that you mentioned, I think are really valid in terms of just the things that we forget, like wearing masks. That changes your whole interaction, and your ability to communicate, your ability to read those verbal and nonverbal skills. And that leads to just a level of newness that we don't know. And that's what I love about this conversation and us coming together, is because of the fact that we don't have the answers, but the fact that we all have different perspectives and we all have different lenses to which we can look at and hold each other kind of more accountable for maybe the things that may slip under the cracks. Is there anything else happening in your respective fields that you see, I don't know, maybe like in terms of forecasting, maybe changes, anything that might be major that you're doing differently, in terms of interacting with people and going forward that you may not have done, because business practices have changed, and a lot of you are working with people who are in need. And so how do you, I guess, think that things will be going forward, or maybe some projections you can make for those constituents that you serve?
So I spend most of my time thinking about the mental health of children and youth. Mm-hmm. And I think the COVID-19, with the layering on of the social unrest, is really shining a light on how vulnerable our children and youth already were in their emotional state. And we've seen since, over the last 20 years, we've seen a 73% uptick of African-American suicides across the nation, right? Black suicide, Indigenous suicide is extremely high and on the rise, and really dependent on where you live. I spend a lot of time talking to young people about, how they are feeling in this moment and in this time. And, that's the beauty of, a lot of this, is that young folks will tell you exactly where they are and where they need to be and what they need, right? I do think that sometimes as adults, we have very much a lens of like what it is they need or what we think they need. And that might not necessarily be the case, but the mental health and the emotional wellness of what's happening right now, I'm very concerned with, because those have lasting effects. Yeah. That's even if we open back up tomorrow, we're going to still see some of those emotional struggles going forward. And what does that look like? Can we create a community and spaces for our young people to feel safe, to share, to heal?
Mm.
I just want to pick up on something that LaShawn was saying about where you live matters. And there's so much in my own work, just looking at community structures, infrastructure, and how where you live has a profound impact on what your future outcomes will be. And so a lot of the work and research that I've done has looked at that very piece. What are the opportunity sort of zones or lack thereof based on where people grow up? And so we all went to A. Philip Randolph, which is in the heart of Harlem, and we came from a number of different neighborhoods spread across New York City. Most of us grew up in zip codes where when you look at whether or not there's access to food, what access to education looks like, parental educational attainment, job availability, right? When you look at how all of those things get compounded in any one small area, it tells a very particular tale about what people end up doing when they're adults. There's this concept about the idea of the stickiness of poverty, right? And so as I think about the stickiness that already existed before we talk about the social unrest, before we talk about the racial tensions that are existing right now, before we think about the pandemic, it's like we just dumped super glue on so many communities that were already living in poverty, and their ability to remove themselves from that will be very difficult. And I think professionals across a number of sectors will have to come together to think about how we develop multi-pronged approaches to help remove some of that stickiness, so that people can emerge from this and still be productive and still be able to pursue some sense of self-fulfillment, because that's really what it is. Like, we like to talk about people being productive members of society. Can I be a productive member of my family, given everything that's going on? Like, if we can start there, then we can talk about how I can be a productive member of my community and how that bubbles out into something bigger. So I'll pause there.
And I think, building on what you said around poverty, and the impact that it have and the kind of lasting effect that it can have on people, I think what we also need to recognize is, like, the businesses, the entrepreneurs in our communities are going to be even more impacted by COVID and the pandemic, right? So there's lots of stats about the number of small businesses that are closing, and then how that number is accelerated within, the African American, Latinx communities. But I think this is also a time where we have to say, this will be a time where there'll be major shifts, right? So most of the major shifts that we're seeing, the ones that we can easily see, are like the Amazon shift, right? They're hiring 100,000 new employees, right? Because so much more business is going through e-com. But you have companies like Shopify and others that are tapping into the major shifts in commerce, right? The traffic in most retail stores are down to 20%, pre-pandemic levels, but people are still shopping. And so where's all that, economic flow happening? And so it's really incumbent upon us, for those who want to pursue entrepreneurial type ventures. This is actually the best time. And I know it's counterintuitive, but when we have those down periods in economic cycles, those are the times when you actually see the most kind of entrepreneurial ventures break through, because they're going to solve a problem that we didn't know existed before. And so if someone has ideas to solve the problems that we're facing now, more likely they're going to be more successful than the folks who, were solving the problems that were pre-pandemic. And so I would encourage people to think about what problems they think are in their communities or in their, in their cities, and how they can solve them, and then how to solve them obviously profitably, so that they can grow their business and keep the dollars in our community.
The idea of community is also something that sort of triggered something for me, because I work in the area of international development. And so for me, when I think about community, I think about us in a global community. So I would encourage that as well when thinking about solving problems. We have problems in our households, we have problems in ourselves that need to be changed, right, in our cities, on our block, in our country, clearly, and then also globally in the world. And when I look at think about the organizations that I work with, and that I've worked for, many of them work in countries promoting education, and in developing countries with high poverty rates and with access to schooling very limited. So in countries where at best, 20% of girls go to secondary school pre-COVID, right? And then you also have now in the current situation, one of my clients just released a report today. At the end of this year, 711 million children will still be out of school. 700, let's just stick with 700 million. 700 million children will be out of school at the end of this year, and out of school from the start, many of them from the start of the pandemic. 84% of those 700 million children are in low-income countries. So when we think about not just the impact, when we think about just the impact that this pandemic is going to have on ourselves and our households, it's, it can be a lot. But when we think about the shifts that actually means for the global community and the world in terms of progress, in terms of achievement, in terms of economic development, it's a lot. And there are a lot of issues, and there are a lot of also opportunities there, because clearly things need to shift and will shift.
Wow. And again, I'm just reminded of how valuable our perspectives are, because like that global perspective, like, that may be off our radar while we're dealing with so much of the day-to-day, minutia that we have to kind of navigate. I'm just looking at the Q&A, and I want to kind of give our audience a chance to participate. I'm just going to read a comment that I heard, and then you can comment on it as you see fit. This is from Raymond Ortega, and he says, if possible, I'd like to say a few things regarding the point touched upon in this meeting. Since we are discussing mental health, I would also like to point out the normalcy that racism has enacted. Even discussing racism makes certain people uncomfortable, and I strongly believe overcoming cognitive dissonance is a crucial step in dismantling racism. Some people allow it to happen and exercise inaction because they're not directly affected. So I'll throw that to the panel. Anybody want to comment on that?
What's really interesting is how things get renamed, right? We've been talking about the same thing for how long, right? It's like a little diversity initiative here. We painted and claimed, refinagled the words again here and there. And we have danced around the word racism on a national level for so long, right? We called it everything but what it was. And one of the things that I would often say, because it's so important to understand the economics of it all, and the fact that low income is an important variable, but we cannot deny that even when you got a ton of money and you look a certain way, you have a certain experience, right? So a lot of times in educational areas and different arenas, it was more comfortable to talk about inequities that existed for low income students, rather than, again, it's the dance around the big R word. And so I do think it's really important that we're finally actually having a conversation about that specific issue, and calling it what it is in open forums, right?
Thank you. And you are right. My point is just to that. Thank you. And actually, building on Stephanie's point, I think we have to be careful to make sure we are talking about racism. And I think it's the cognitive dissonance and that dance that, because of the way that the world unfortunately works, it tends to still get shaken up. So for example, in some of my work, I facilitate difficult conversations. The number of times that I would say in the past 2 months, I've turned down 3 opportunities to work with different boards and international organizations, because the request initially came as, we want to have this talk about racism, but what they really want is a conversation because the white people are uncomfortable. So when we get into the nitty gritty, it's like, oh, well, maybe you can do a presentation on white fragility. Excuse me? Like, that's actually the conversation about a presentation and discussion on white fragility is the conversation on racism. And then they'll say, well, it's because when we try to raise these discussions, then, people's feelings get hurt, and the Black and brown people and people of color get quiet. And I'm like, they're quiet because we're tired, because still this conversation is centered on you. So I think it's always just, we need to check, like, who is at the center of the conversation? And sometimes, things are incremental, but I think, we need to be clear. Sometimes we even now, we think we're having conversations about race and racism, but we're actually not.
So I want to respond to what Dr. Taylor and Stephanie just said. Kelly, there is a question above the one that you just read, just FYI, so we don't miss it.
It ties in with our third segment. I'm on it, so thank you.
Okay. But I do want to re-emphasize, even within racism, sometimes I have to be very clear about what I'm talking about. And sometimes I'm talking about racism, and sometimes I'm talking about anti-Blackness. Okay. And that conversation is something that I have to have with some of my other people of color, right? Because the reality is there's a racial hierarchy in America. And at the top of that hierarchy is white, the bottom of that hierarchy is Black. And a lot of times, everyone else in between spends a lot of time trying to prove to white people that they are not Black. So what we see often is that there is an anti-Blackness that is showing up in policies, in structures, reinforced by white supremacy, reinforced by these ideas of whiteness, right? So even within racism, there are some times when I think, oh no, we need to get a little bit more granular about who we're talking about, what we're talking about, because the outcomes are different across racial lines for different reasons.
Wow. Yeah, and I'd like to add to that if I may. I think that was well said, LaShawn. And I mean, I've lost count of the number of times I've walked into predominantly white spaces and immediately just kind of get focused on as similar to what you said, Alicia, just like we want to hear from you about what we are doing wrong or what more we could be doing as white people to try and further this message. And I think, just tying back in the mental health component, just for anyone like this who might be a person of color working in a place where they're underrepresented. And, there is certainly an opportunity as a person to break that mold, right, and flip the script on just what it means to be a person of color and to succeed in corporate culture. But at the same time, you don't owe anyone anything. You're not you don't have to let people coin you as this expert on race just because you have some melanin on your skin. And I think this is something myself that I've had to learn. It's okay to take a step back from that conversation. It's not on me. And I notice how often it happens, like when an organization decides to put a racial equity or some sort of diversity initiative together, their first step usually is to just take all the people of color and put them in the room and say, all right, you got it. And I really think that people are dropping the ball when they do that. And I think why the conversation is so difficult to have is because people think about racism in terms of the very explicit actions by people, like the racial slurs, the violence, and all that. But actually, I think the biggest threat as far as racism goes are perpetrated by people who might be very well-intentioned. They might not even consider themselves as racist, or they might even say, I have Black friends or people who in my family are people of color and all that. But they're almost turning a blind eye, whether intentionally or not, to seeing that there's a difference between that sort of racism and the more structural institutional racism. And the difference being, if everyone in that system wasn't racist, it will still have racist outcomes for people operating within that system, whether it's housing or jobs, et cetera. And I think that over time, firstly, the country was basically built off of that. A lot of the success in the country in America was based off of inequity. And I think there was always this pressure for people to assimilate and to sort of get as close to that spectrum of whiteness as possible because it was considered a status symbol. I mean, if you look on the census, what's the number one option? It's white. And so I think that having that conversation with people is important, and then also just talking about the coded language. I think laws have been passed now so that it's very difficult to have explicitly racist laws and policies, but they're still there. If you think about the debate that we just had, and I won't get too much into my opinions about it, but the way that the terms law and order were used when talking about Black Lives Matter, for example, that's all intentional, and that's racialized language, even though it's a little bit, easy. It's not as easy to spot as the racial language that was used decades ago in relation to people of color.
The only thing I would say is that I think it's interesting to the point raised earlier. I don't say this with pride, but when George Floyd was killed, I kind of missed the original moment, right? Only because I wasn't watching the news because of COVID, and I was just tuning out of news. And I started getting all these messages at work about, hey, can you help us with this? We need to figure out. And I'm like, what do you need help with? And then I realized what they were talking about. And then I'm like, well, why is this moment? Because I still hadn't seen the video. And I was like, why is now all of a sudden, my company, my colleagues concerned with Black Lives Matter? And that disconnect for me really symbolizes the fact that, growing up in New York, like Amadou Diallo, I'm messing up his name, but Amadou Diallo, I remember, that to me is like one of my early memories of that kind of violence perpetrated on African Americans by the police outside of historical context, right? And so I say all this to say that like the fact that now they want us in that conversation is great, but it's a little late, right? And but it's our role, unfortunately or not, to try to move the conversation along however we can. And I think that's the challenge for us, is that we have to play dual roles, right? Like I'm talking from a corporate America perspective.
Mm-hmm.
We have to play this dual role because you want your career to continue to rise and be successful, and to, as I like to say, play the corporate game. But at the same time, you know that there's things that need to be done and changed. And how do you balance those two things? And some folks are better at it than others. But it's definitely something that puts more pressure on us in our communities, in the Latin community, to have to carry that burden, to carry both our professional and career aspirations, along with making sure that other folks have a passageway into the same paths that you currently have.
I think that was well said. I appreciate that comment, just in allowing that space to realize how much pressure it is. Like I'm just thinking also with the George Floyd murder, it was just a lot to take in. And I had asked this earlier about, just society being numb, not because they want to be per se, but because, they may have to be, like, to the points that were made earlier, like we just have so much going on in our day-to-day lives that sometimes the magnitude can get drowned out, so to speak. But again, it's due to that self-care. Like there were points where I had to literally kind of protect myself because of the fact that too much information coming in was going to be just overwhelming, and it doesn't seem to stop, in that respect. I wanted to shift, and we've been touching on the economic components, but I'm very interested in thinking, or in your thoughts, just in terms of, in the economic landscape. But I look, for example, at education, and the fact that now how we're educating kids is drastically different. We're still trying to figure it out. We're doing some remote learning. There's some partial in-person learning. But I see, as a result of this, a distinct shift that's going to happen, not only in society with a group of kids now that we are not going to really be able to kind of factor in how this is going to affect them until we get a few years out, but then also being that there's this change in education, how is the economy going to shift? We know that the pandemic, I know personally many, many people who have lost their jobs, small business owners that have lost their jobs. So when we look at the economy, when we look at your perspective, areas of expertise in your professional realms, what is the economy going to look like? I mean, in terms of how we prepare kids, what is, in school, curriculum wise, or what jobs will be needed, being that there are these shifts in terms of maybe what you're seeing, and if you could speak to that.
I'll start. I think I read an article yesterday, I think it was US News, that said due to remote learning, on average, students who are doing remote learning now are going to have 3% less lifetime income than they were forecasted. And that's going to have anywhere from a $14 to $28 trillion impact on our economy. And so the students are going to be behind the eight ball in many ways, and it's not fair to them. And I think it puts more pressure on parents and communities to subsidize and support the students in their learning. But I think overall, what I've seen professionally is that anything with math and science is a winner for you from a career perspective, right? You very rarely hear people in IT getting laid off. There's one, because they have all the information and they can shut everything down. But two, that's where everything is going. Big data, data scientists, all the new IPOs that are happening are all about data analytics, storing data, analyzing data. So if you're in a STEM field right now, I think your money. I think where the challenges will come are in some of the softer skills, right? Because a lot of those things are actually being converted into, automated, right? Like they're looking at options like in fast food, there's arms now that can, flip the burger. And like, that was a job that you didn't think would be taken away from, people. But now if you can't even get a job in, Mickey D's because you lost it to a robot arm, like that's going to be a problem. And AI is going to do a lot of that in the future. And I don't want to sound like like futuristic and some kind of sci-fi movie, but that it's already happening, and COVID has accelerated that, and it will continue to, because people need to they don't want to be in the same space with people. So a robot can do that. They're not going to catch COVID. So I think my point is STEM is where students should focus, because that is going to be probably in the future, in our immediate future, the most recession-proof and high growth areas in our economy.
As someone who's currently working in the data science analytics field, I completely agree with what Wanza said. And all these skills that I'm using now related to data and technology, I learned them through free platforms online. I realize there's a nuance in terms of how people are able to learn and stuff, but you don't need to go through a debt sentence in a 4-year university to get a job that's paying you well and that is recession proof, right? It's a highly demanded field. We need more people of color in the AI space. For those who don't know what AI is, it's artificial intelligence. It governs a lot of the technology that we interact with. It controls what we see on our Facebook feed. It controls how many cops are in your neighborhood at any given time. And we are consistently seeing issues in that field where the underrepresentation of people of color and you're starting to see inequitable outcomes where people are being wrongfully arrested. Motion sensing technology is not finding people with dark enough pigments of skin. And I mean, the list goes on as far as all those applications and all the racial inequities that are being perpetuated through AI. So if math and STEM, like Wanza said, you're good money there. I would say go for it. There's so many free resources out there for people to get into that field. And again, I didn't need to go to school for it. So.
To give another perspective, I think this question is why programs like SBI are so important. I don't think you necessarily have to just think about math and science as your only way out. I think you have to look at an undergraduate program that makes you adaptable to be able to change, because COVID isn't the first one and it's not going to be the last. It's a free market economy. It's always changing, and you have to just be able to have the skill sets to adapt to that change. But another thing, let's not sleep on the arts, because when everybody was trapped in their houses, what did everybody turn to? Right. They turned to the poets. They turned to the entertainers to give them some kind of meaning and expression through these hard times. I think we need to put more funding there, and I hope COVID has helped us realize just how important these fields are. And I don't think, even though I am in the math and science field, I don't think that is the only way of making it. I wish I was encouraged in middle school and elementary school to pursue more artistic abilities, but I simply just wasn't. They said, become a doctor, become a lawyer, that's it, So I think we really should try to give different perspectives on that.
Yeah, and I'll actually, second Jennifer's comments as well. And I'll say this, one thing that I see happening on multiple folds. With Zoom and Zoom education, parents are seeing how their kids are being educated and they don't like it, right? And I do think that there is going to be a reckoning within the teaching field to have more racially equitable practices within the classroom, right? So I'm going to go ahead and put teachers right up there in terms of professions that are needed with people who have a racially equitable lens. The other thing I'm going to talk about is the fact that we have a president who formed a 1776 commission to re-educate students on history. Intellectuals are under attack, right? That's just a fact. Nationally, intellectuals are under attack. My prediction is that we're going to see a need for more people who understand history, for more people who understand sociology, anthropology, the impact of the economy on populations, public health, right? I mean, the public health field has exploded. I'm in public health, and this is a guaranteed job. or if you are in health in any way, shape, or form right now, whether it's on the policy side or whether it is actually in a hospital or clinic, you're fine, right? So I do think that this idea of a strong economy, we should think about this more broadly and play to people's strengths, because everyone is needed in the village, right? Like, you can't have that many IT folks. You can't have that many bankers, right? You need the bankers, you need the IT folks, you need the AI folks, you also need the teachers, you also need the historians, you also need the social scientists. That's what makes a society.
Can I just pick up, oh, sorry.
Sorry, just a quick point to piggyback off of that and what Stephanie said a while earlier about having these conversations. Because of Trump's, I was thinking about this earlier, I didn't say it, because of that policy that you mentioned, it is so important to have conversations like this in the household too, because a lot of this is going to be filtered. So the policy, if I read it correctly, it says that if you receive government funding of any kind, you are filtered in what you are saying automatically. So just going back to the importance of why conversations like this are so important and why we need to have them, especially with the kids that are growing up during this time.
I just wanted to reiterate actually something that Monza said in response to an earlier question just about the importance of entrepreneurial skills.
Yes.
And really thinking about them as life skills. You know, I think in addition to, regardless of what sector you go into, whether it's arts, whether it's IT and math, people need to come out of households understanding what an LLC is, what a tax shelter is, how do you incorporate yourself. So I'll give you, for example, I have my own business as a consultant. Consultants who were just working independently and didn't have an LLC, they had less access to like PPP loans and some of the small business recovery loans than I did, simply because they hadn't taken that step. And the step literally took 15 minutes, but they make it seem as though it's something huge. You can set up, you could, in the next 5 minutes, if you wanted to set up an LLC, you could go to a website and set yourself up an LLC. But it makes you, you know, without having the information on how to do that and how easy it is and how necessary actually it is, it seems like it's some huge, like 3-year process that takes, you know, costs $1,500 is $99.
I think maybe I was too forceful in my recommendation around the STEM space. I think I was asked, I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. Like, I was answering Kelly's question about what areas that would be more beneficial to you if you want to place your bets. But I will say this: there is I don't work in, well, not technically, I don't work in STEM myself, but I do know that those are the folks that anytime a reorg is happening, whether it's my wife's field, my field, the additional people, the people that they're bringing on are always the data analysts and always the kind of the data scientists. And, you know, my company, other companies, every time there's a reorg now, that is the group that gets added, while other groups oftentimes are being subtracted or reduced. It's not going away, but they're reduced or subtracted. And so I just want to put that in that context that, one, I completely agree, pursue your passions, because if you go into STEM and you hate math, then you're going to have a terrible career. But if you like math, then obviously, you know, pursue STEM. But I think it is true that there's lots of pathways to success, but there are some easier pathways, I would say, than others.
Yeah, if I could get a quick rebuttal in there too, because I didn't really give much context. My background actually educationally is in the social sciences. I majored in communications and business administration. And so, you know, it wasn't, I didn't study STEM. However, all those, you know, professions that were mentioned, whether a historian or, you know, someone who looks at maps, cartographers, artists, musicians, poets, there's some sort of technology that is in their space, guaranteed. And if you're going to study it, yeah, it's worth learning the skill. The only point I was trying to make is don't feel pressured to just put, if you're trying to decide on what degree or field of study to go into, I wouldn't feel pressure to study STEM because that's what's going to make you money. But I would say there is a shift in the economy as far as more value on skills than there are on degrees. And I would say whatever your field is, I would recommend learning the tools of the trade, whatever that field happens to be. There's guaranteed to be technology in there somewhere. And there are many resources out there with the democratization of information where you can start learning those skills at low to no cost. So that was just a quick point of clarification there.
I just wanted to say really quickly what we all have, everybody on this Zoom call, and it's something that SBI is really good at, is Tara also has this model called community cultural wealth, right? And it's thinking about the different types of capital that really stick with you. So thinking about resistance capital, navigational capital. There's more than just like social capital and the actual finances of it all. Those are the threads that once those things are in you, it's exactly what we're talking about. You can pivot regardless of what the situation looks like. And I think that is part of what we want to think about in terms of what do students need to learn? What will the market look like? We don't know. We know that the computers are going to do a lot of stuff, right? But we need deep thinkers. And a lot of that happens in sort of a liberal arts space and through giving people, even if it's not a traditional liberal arts school, I work at a community college, giving people experiences where they can make practical application to whatever concepts it is that they're learning, and giving them, again, the tools to just be able to pivot when the pivot is necessary.
And I think that's a perfect point, speaking of pivot, to really kind of switch gears to our last segment, because we've talked a lot about the problems and a lot of the things that are happening now. But we also want to talk about solutions, and we want to talk about some of the things that we know can work given our current times. And so when we think about SBI, we know SBI has had a long-standing history, over 30 years of working with students and really being delving deep into the community and really helping to make a difference. But I want to actually use this opportunity to put some clarity and to put some things into context about what SBI is and how this organization is now going to be or should be seen going forward. So I'm going to actually turn it over to you, Dr. Akunvabe, to really kind of set the tone for why is SBI the solution, and more importantly, if you can explain more about the IGC model, the framework that SBI is connected to.
So the IGC model, it stands for Inclusive Grassroots Cooperative. And when we think about what it means for one specific organization to be embedded in a public school for over 30 years, there's a certain power there in terms of what happens to just being able to create a network, just thinking about the continuity that exists and what that allows a community to do in order to leverage its resources and also to leverage its own political power. There are oftentimes, we know, changes in leadership that naturally occur, whether it be principals, changes in chancellors. I mean, New York City has the largest public school system in the country. And just when you think about the nuances of that, thinking back on some of the things we were talking about where you live, how that matters and how that impacts sort of long-term outcomes, SBI's decision to embed itself within a specific institution, almost adopting a very specific school, and just, again, being nimble enough to go with the ebbs and flows of the time, the ebbs and flows of the changing school system, it provides a certain level of stability within a community where there might be a lack of resources, and looking at alternative funding sources to support what it is the school might do. It produces people like us. And there's something magical about that, knowing a lot of the folks coming from single parent homes, people who are first in their family to go to college, coming from really low income backgrounds, coming from neighborhoods where crime rates might be high and educational attainment might be low, to then just see what comes after. And we're all examples of that. So that's kind of what that is.
That's awesome. I was wondering if the panelists, if each of you could actually think about and speak to maybe 2 or 3 specific components of SBI that kind of helped shape you to be who you are today. What was it about being a part of SBI that you feel, was something that you were able to kind of take and that you're applying now? So I'll let everyone.
Maybe I should start, since I think I was in the first cohort. And I actually cringed when you said 30 years, because in my head I'm still like 32.
No, don't close.
But
Don't.
I'm 45.
Okay.
So it was 30 years ago, literally. For me, the things that benefited me were and I'm looking at the screen, the college prep, college and career prep. I think the college prep, just I have memories of sitting and having people going over my college entrance essays, and also my, because I was grateful to be able to go to Spelman on a full scholarship. And if it weren't for SBI, I think Mr. Thompson looked at my essay and my scholarship essay and my entry essay. So that really hands-on practical support. And then just continuing to encourage us to, you know, in terms of career, I think part of the career prep is just the encouragement that you can do and be anything that you want. In terms of the thing that stuck with me, though, it's actually the image of Mr. Thompson my junior or senior year popping up in our classrooms and saying, like, I haven't seen you in the SBI office. I need to see you after class. Excuse me, can he be excused? Come with me now. And so it reminds me of my own responsibility for personal engagement and personal commitment. And that's something that continues to inspire me and drive me.
So first thing, Alicia, I'm also a Spelman grad, so we should talk.
Hey, all right. Okay, we'll be following up, sis.
Yes. So my experience is very similar in terms of my involvement was mostly with college prep. And, you know, like many of us, my parents couldn't really guide me on the college track and really advise me on that, right? So SBI's ability to show a world of not just colleges, but colleges outside of your comfort zone, I think I really did appreciate, because had it not for me leaving New York and going to Spelman, I don't think I would have had any of the experiences that I have been just, you know, so lucky to have since. So that is probably my biggest memory and my biggest connection.
Yeah, for me, it was really more on the career prep side. So there was that college prep element for me, but the career prep was really what stands out in my life and in my career. So my very first job, because I was probably too lazy to get a job before then, but was as an intern. And I got that internship through a program that Mr. Thompson introduced me to, and it was an internship in the PR department of a record label. And to this day, it probably is still the coolest job I've ever had as a teenager, working at a record label with the biggest hip hop artists at the time coming out, and being able to go to the first Source Awards. So I'm definitely dating myself here, because people probably don't even remember the Source Awards. But so, you know, that was that experience. But I didn't realize that it was shaping my career, because I did go down the STEM route. I was an engineering student at campus. I majored in engineering as an undergrad. I worked for a year in IT. And then I went to get my MBA, and I went to a workshop about brand management and marketing. And I was like, that's what I want to do. But I only knew that's what I wanted to do because I had the experience from my very first job as an intern in PR. And ever since then, I've been pursuing a career in marketing. And I don't think I would have found that passion without SBI and without Mr. Thompson and the connections. And the other piece that SBI helped me with was, and we don't put enough value on this in our community, and I preach this a lot, is networking. And it took a long time in my own personal career to figure out, like, I knew, oh yeah, you should network, be nice, you know, go to happy hours or things of that nature. But we put so much emphasis in the African-American community and the Latino community on hard work. Hard work is just the entry door, like the entry level. Like, that's not going to get you promoted in your career. That's not going to get you the new business. That is the basement. That's bare minimum. Right. And a piece that we don't talk about out in the community is, you know, networking in terms of building your network and having people advocate for you when you're not in the room. And that's only going to happen when you put in the hard work, but then you build relationships with people. And through SBI networking, I remember doing a program with Nike. We had like a basketball tournament in the city. And it was only because I talked to the gentleman who was the head of marketing for Nike in New York City at the time. And he was like, yeah, we do this tournament. And he's like, yeah, you should join. Here's how you sign up. And I followed up. Like he's like, yeah, call me. And I called him and he didn't answer. And then I called him again. And he was like, all right, yes, all right, fine. Here's how you're gonna get the internship. And so those are the two things that really catapulted me in my career is kind of having that spark and having that opportunity, and then realizing the importance and learning at an early age the skills that come with networking.
So I would say one of the sort of, I think, taken for granted, at least back when I was in the program, one of the things taken for granted was how SBI was actually embedded in the school. It made such a big difference. And I think, I'm first generation in my family to go over to college. And so, before this program, it was, my education was really not something that I had a high priority on, because I knew I was operating in a system where I wasn't going to be set up for success. And I think, I've come a long way in terms of understanding the colonial sort of roots behind our education system, and how it's actually a sense of pride, right? In terms of learning your history, getting your education despite that. But the biggest factor with that was having your friends and people that you knew and went to class with. And I mean, you physically couldn't leave the building without passing either Thompson's office or the auditorium. And if he saw you leave when you skipped out after a few sessions, you knew he was going to find you, and he knew about where you were at and things like that. A big factor was just constantly being surrounded by people who looked like me, who were thinking about college or careers or advancement, things that, messaging that we weren't necessarily being exposed to as regularly without this program. And so, it became almost second nature. After a while, you just stop thinking about how hard it is to get past these obstacles and make it into college, for example. And it just became something that you thought about so often that it just became an eventuality. And obviously there's like hard work and a lot of steps in between, but it made a big difference, especially like the career days. It really got me started with public speaking and leadership. I was a very quiet person before that. And just seeing people who look like me up on the stage, who were in banking or finance or the arts or this or that, it was inspiring. It changed my perspective on how far away those things were. And when you can actually see yourself in a space, that's the first step to actually making it into that space. Like Juanza said, obviously there's some hard work, but then also learning how to work a room and interact with people. Because at the end of the day, we're all human, and that's what we all crave, some interaction. And I think, the whole concept of code switching, of what sort of etiquette you might want to practice a little bit, depending on just what environment you're in. And just developing a little bit of like, I would say like social finessing a little bit, where you're able to sort of like look at a room and understand, how you can maneuver through there and make some genuine connections with people, but at the same time accomplish your goals, regardless of who's in the room or if you know them or not. So that was huge. First time I stepped on a college campus was with SBI, and just that whole concept of visualizing. You have to first see yourself in a space before you could ever hope to get there. So that was massive for me.
SBI has a really strong relationship with Gettysburg College. They have a lot of alumni there, and that's where I ended up going to undergrad, thanks to Mr. Thompson. So I say that to say that it's a very white school. My first day on campus, I saw a Confederate flag just casually hanging off of somebody's pickup truck. So I felt very out of place, and what helped me stick with it and continue it was seeing other SBI alumni there and having that network. Because I don't have a privilege of saying, oh, like I went to boarding school with all these kids and now I go to college with them. So that was so impactful for me, because it was like, it made me feel like a sense of community there. And the fact that a program from Harlem can do that in rural Pennsylvania for me really, really made a huge difference in my undergraduate career and really kept me motivated to continue and finish.
I think that everyone's testimony right now is just amazing in terms of just how dynamic SBI is. And I appreciate, Stephanie, you're contextualizing and you know, coming up with that IGC, because I think that will help to better explain what it is that we do. The one thing that I wanted to just mention in terms of the IGC model is if you could just speak quickly about the possibility of it being replicated. Like SBI is obviously unique, and the IGC framework is unique to SBI and A. Philip Randolph, but how is it that this notion of the IGC framework, how can that possibly be used maybe in other schools and other communities?
So the thing that is special about SBI is that it was for us. Like when you hear everybody's story here, you hear the personal components that were there. And so part of why I think public education has some of the challenges that it does is that it does take a cookie cutter model, and it expects that the same approach is going to work for every student. And we know that doesn't work. What the model in and of itself suggests is that a school and the opportunities that exist within it should be based on the students, the families, and the surrounding community supports that are there. For example, SBI has a very strong relationship with Harlem Stage because it's literally across the street from the school. That makes sense. You know, how do you think about the physical location of a public school and really capitalize on the resources that are there, capitalize on the strengths of the community that is there, rather than trying to take some outside bits of things from a textbook that we aren't 100% sure will be applicable to the population that's in that building. And so that's also the importance of the longevity, right? Just the neighborhood in and of itself and the student body at Randolph has changed over the course of that 30 years. And when you have an organization that is there and able to witness those changes and pivot in a way that says, oh, wait, the student body looks like this. I know when I was there wasn't a DESI group. The population changed where there was also a lot of South Asian students who started coming to the school. SBI pivoted and started creating a performing arts program to speak to those students. Sure. That wasn't there when I was there, but the population wasn't there. So it wasn't a need for that. So just that ability to change and really be mindful about what are the resources that are here? Yes, there are outside things that we need to bring in, but there's such a richness of culture that the students bring with them every day that if we tap into it, the pieces that they don't know. So all the stuff that we didn't know about career, all the stuff that we didn't know about how to access college, the pieces of who we are were acknowledged in a way that we were willing to listen and be open to learning about the pieces that helped us get to where we are right now. And so that can be replicated. It's taking all of those pieces about creating an individualized, personalized education, appreciating the neighborhood that a school is in, appreciating the people that show up at the institution, and tailoring it to really help people reach their fullest potential.
Before we open the floor for some questions and answers, I do want to address one question that came up, and it's very fitting. It says, how are Randolph alumni coming together to affect our educational system and our country, or how can we start to come together to organize? So you are all very indicative of what SBI really embodies in terms of the student that we are trying to have into society. So what can we say to alumni that may be watching or that will watch in terms of how they can come together and organize?
I think it starts with the networking, right? Like if you're an alum and you're in a certain space, I know, for example, in Wanza, you were saying that first internship was so important. I know the first internship that I got coming out of A. Philip Randolph was at Time Warner. I would love to be in a space. Right now, the job situation is a little funny, but in terms of just what we can do in terms of welcoming interns into certain spaces. But if there are alum who have a space, who have the capacity to welcome an intern in, that's important. That's a really concrete way to give back, because we know if we're not creating these internship experiences for people in our communities, chances are they're not going to have those experiences, especially because the job market is so tight and so kind of shaky the way that it is. So I think that's one way to give back and to help ensure that the next generation is going to be all right.
I think another really critical way to give back is clearly through resources, and I think we have to encourage one another and remind each other that no amount is too small. There's an example is there's a community, an online community that Humans of New York has created, and just through sharing these stories of this one woman and opening up a GoFundMe page for her living trust, for her a living trust, they raised $2.5 million so far, and it's likely going to go to well over $3 million. And if you look at the contribution levels, it's people who gave $5, $25. When I scrolled through, I didn't see many contributions over $25, $3 million, you know. And so I think just in reminding us that we're each philanthropists, right? And even if whether or not we call ourselves that, that's really what we are. We give sometimes to our churches. We have funds for our families. That's philanthropy. Like, you know, we can peel off $5, $10, $25, or just make a commitment, because understanding, again, following the money, we need every organization and movement and entity needs an issue needs resources.
You took the words right out of my mouth, which is where I started with the session, which is everybody can give back, right? And they got their ways, and SBI is no different. I think Mr. Thompson and his investment in the students over the years, myself, other people here, he's probably given up. I don't want to estimate what he's given up in terms of his career earnings to give back to SBI. And so what we have to do is we have to do the same thing. And I think, a lot of times in our community, we don't think about giving back in the ways that other communities do. And giving back financially with time, with skills, with opportunities, internships, jobs, summer jobs, all these things are things that the students and SBI need. And so I would say, whatever you can give, do it because it's needed. Mr. Thompson's not going to turn you down. He's not going to say no, as long as it's appropriate for the young men and women in the program. And so I would encourage everybody to find their way to give back.
I would add a mentorship to that as well. So if you are an alum who has the capacity to be a mentor to any of the students, I think that helps. One thing that I hear often is, young professionals going, I would love a mentor who looks like me. I wouldn't recommend waiting on that because that could be really hard and long. But for those of us who are in the position to mentor, I think that's very, very important.
Just a quick reminder, we do have that 30 for 30 campaign for, those that want to contribute. You can look at the website and then find ways to get involved. Because I think even if it's not about financially getting involved, it might be just about staying connected. So even if we have your contact information, it might not be something you can do now, but at least we're still being able to include you and count you. What I want to do in the time that we have remaining, I want to open the floor for any questions or maybe comments that anyone that might be watching may have. I think we can allow those that are watching to unmute themselves if they had a comment or a question.
So Kelly.
Yes.
So this is Thompson, and I have a quick comment.
Okay.
First of all, I've been sitting here watching with my family, and this has been so impressive. Stephanie said, this is the kind of thing that we need to do. This is a sample of power. Coming together, bringing ideas together at the table. This is at the core what SBI has always been about. And to watch you young men and women in this conversation, I got my money's worth for all 30 years, Yamanza. We're even now, it's even. Just listening to you all and seeing the power in what you said, that's what it's about. And what you did today representing this alumni group from A. Philip Randolph High School has never happened at any historically Black and brown school in New York City, ever. The kinds of things that we are positioning ourselves to be able to do with the Alumni and Friends Committee for A. Philip Randolph High School will be groundbreaking. And what we can do together will give us the same power as the alumni organization has at Brooklyn Tech, or at LaGuardia, or at Townsend Harris, or Bronx Science, because there's only one A. Philip Randolph Campus High School. And that Harlem history, where people come from all over the city, is something that my friends in Baltimore are talking about, my friends in DC are talking about, folks are talking about in Philly, people who went to those schools that were legendary schools and say, how do we save those and make those institutions a part of our history? Thank you all for your words and what you gave tonight, because what you said tonight is things that we can use to help generate funding, to let people say that we do matter and we are worthy of support. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. T.
I think we have another comment.
Hello.
Raymond, is that you?
Yes, it is.
Yes, you have the floor, Raymond.
Yes, I would just like to say I called Thompson earlier today because I was looking forward to this panel. However, I do wish we would have delved more into the more racial aspect of things. Like, the problem is that Black lives should matter on their own, you know, with money or not, with education or not, with access to resources or not, because we can follow the money all we want, but historically the map has always been full of bumps and roads and obstacles to prevent us from following the money. So I think that we should focus on the humanitarian part of it. Breonna Taylor was an EMT and she got shot in her house while sleeping. Right. Even the most educated and even the wealthiest of Black people are still seen as Black first and nothing else second. And regarding institutions like predominantly white universities, I think that diversity training needs to be reformed from the bottom up, because we cannot talk about racism without talking about it in all aspects. And I think that while diversity training is cute, for lack of a better word, you know, we can talk about microaggressions and things like that, but racism is such a deeper rabbit hole than that. And I don't think that we're gonna make any steps until, like I posted in the Q&A, we get over cognitive dissonance. Racism is an ugly experience for Black people, and it is an ugly conversation that needs to be addressed in its explicit nature. Because if we go back in history, it's replete with examples. Racism is not a pretty conversation. It's not supposed to be. So I think that the more that we can get people to actually want to have this conversation in its entirety, without any sugarcoating or any nuance, because there's no nuance when you see a Black person get shot or killed innocently. So I feel like when we talk about racism, we need to talk about it with the same breath that we talk about more intense things.
I agree. And Raymond, to your point, I hear everything you're saying. I appreciate your comment. And I'll factor that in to say that hopefully we can continue this conversation in additional, you know, installments of SBI Alumni Speak. So I think, you know, your comments are spot on. So thank you again for that.
Thank you.
I'm looking at the time and I'm looking at the chat, and I apologize if we weren't able to get to everyone's comment or question, but I just want to, in the interest of time, just be mindful of everyone's time and just say thank you again to all of our panelists. I appreciate your time and your conversation and your willingness to share in this platform, and this being, again, the first in a series of panels that we will hopefully have. I want to thank all of our viewers again for tuning in and sharing the link and supporting. We hope that you will continue. I also want to remind you that we have a very exciting virtual gala coming up in about 10 days, October 11th at 4 p.m. We want you all to be there. Please spread the word. You can visit the website and register. And again, we just want you to recognize that we definitely know that our voice is important, and we do need a platform to come together to have our voices heard. And this is, again, the first in a series of conversations that we will have. So again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to the SBI board, Mr. Thompson, and everyone that was involved in putting this event together. Nico as well. And good night. Thank you.